Welcome to the Data Coffee Break podcast. I'm Marc.
And I'm Christian.
If you are passionate about data like us, take a seat, relax, and join us to our coffee break where we discuss all things data.
And remember, there are no filters, no PR.
It's just a real life experience. So let's begin.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to the Data Coffee Break podcast. Marc, how are you doing?
Very good here. Came back from a night out. Just had my favorite snacking food, which is peanut butter. So everything is fine for me.
Sounds
And
good.
you?
Yeah, no, all good. Having my coconut flat white as per usual. Today's episode, first of all, we are overwhelmed by the great feedback.
Yeah, thanks everyone
And
for
welcoming
that.
for our first episode with Peter. We thank Peter again for coming here, and we really appreciate your feedback. Today we have a different type of episode. Marc, would you like to explain us what is this episode going to be about?
Episode or like the structure actually we're doing?
Yes, you can go with the structure.
Yeah, so we had last week the episode with Peter Johnson, so a guest in the episode. This week we're doing like kind of a one-on-one conversation with Christian, as we usually do at the coffee machine. And that's going to be pretty much for the moment what we think as being like the structure for us. So 1 week we have a guest, 1 week just both of us having a quick chat on that. So let's see how it's going to be. And today we're going to give you some tips. We thought about the top 10 tips when it comes to presenting your data results to an audience.
That's correct, Marc. As we always mention, right? Our mission on this podcast is to inform you and help you, growing on this changing data landscape. So we want to start with the basics. Tip number 1, always check your tech setup. And I know this sounds super silly, but I think we all been there. We start, can you share your screen? Let me share my screen. And then you end up with a permissions issue, an error,
of course,
or when Zoom is not allowed, or even sometimes like you get into the room because now we are going back to work and you realize that there is no adapter for your machine or there is no way to really connect.
I will always advise to keep to have your own adapter, basically,
Yes.
like a HDMI and VGA adapter.
Exactly.
Like always in your back pocket.
Exactly.
It's such an essential.
Yes, exactly. So how do we do this? As Marc mentioned, right? So you always need to have your adapters. But one thing that I usually do, and I learned it from an ex-colleague, he usually, before really starting the session, let's say, for example, you connect via Zoom, Teams, Google Meet, you say hi, and before introducing, he always used to say, before starting, can we just make a quick check that we can share our screen? And that, to be honest, was really useful, right? Because you don't always control the meeting. If you control the meeting invite, then of course you can log in before. But when this is not yours, I think this is not unpolite. What do you think?
Yeah. In particular, as you said, like at the beginning, we all have some sort of issues because there is so many platforms now to do video calls. And I don't know if it's my experience, but I feel I face few issues sharing my screen with a Mac.
Yeah.
So having those settings done correctly before is fantastic. Or like, as you said, maybe at the beginning of the session could be quite handy. It depends. I'm guessing it depends if it's expected who is potentially going to share the screen in this case, right?
Yes. We are already like a post-COVID, right? So I think everyone has a camera. Everyone knows how to log in. So I think that is granted. But seriously, like checking the tech setup, or if you go in person, really check that you have all your adapters. That would say is the basics. But this was just a warm-up.
Actually, I will add something, 1 or 2 things.
Okay, add
on the tech side. I mean, that relates to us as well. Like, always have a backup in terms of internet connectivity.
Yeah.
I have to do it personally. Like sometimes my internet is not working, so I need to connect with my phone directly. So that could be a good one.
That's a really good point, because right now, even if you have access, or if you are in a place with 4G, I think it's enough. I give you a personal story here at my new place. The provider, I'm not going to say which is the provider, but took around 1 month or 6 weeks to get the internet connected. And I was using 4G to connect, and it was, of course, it wasn't perfect all the time, but it was enough, right? I was able to share my screen. I was able to, of course, I needed to stop my camera from time to time, but I really agree. Having your phone, or make sure that you can tether from your phone, or sometimes you go into the customer company and there is no Wi-Fi, then you just make sure that you have signal and you can do tethering.
All right, tip number 2. I think I'm going to take this one. I would say do a discovery before agreeing to have this presentation. The idea is basically in this discovery phase is to figure out who is the audience, what is the goal of the presentation, literally, what might be the outcome wanted, what the audience would like to see, if it's the audience who's asking basically for this presentation. But when I ask like figuring out the audience, I think I have a great story about a friend. He did a degree of data science in a university here in the UK, and then he went on an internship in the airline industry, basically. So a summer, if I'm correct, it was a summer internship, and he had to analyze quite a lot of data. And the grand finale of his internship is obviously dissertation, but a presentation to executive team. And he kind of explained to me that he went through all these slides, all those numbers, statistical models, and things like that. And he realized at the end, speaking with some of the members of the audience, that they not really understood what he was talking about when he spoke about all those models, all those statistical prevalence, or like a percentage of change, and that can be very daunting and difficult. And he told me, I realized at this point that he didn't do a discovery on figuring out who is the audience, what kind of level of data literacy. In this case, it was a lot of data science words and lingo. So it was obviously difficult for this audience who never been exposed to that. So he realized he could have like basically simplified, went to the essentials in this presentation, to adapt to the audience, because it's always super important to tailor your message, tailor the presentation to the audience. I don't know if you had something similar as an experience.
I remember one of my first meetings, I think something like 10 years ago, I got the same thing, right? Like I was presenting, it was more around a demonstration of data results. I mean, like, I had like some charts created here and there. We're going to go. But I remember that I thought that every single click that I was going to do, every single sentence, and then when I finished the session, I felt like, okay, I actually conveyed my message. And I remember that one person came to me and said, like, you presented very well, but I had no idea what you were saying.
Oh no!
And as you mentioned, that it was just because it was too technical, right? And the audience, as you mentioned, the discovery that you need to do, like the audience was not the correct one, right? So you need to figure out the audience who you're talking to, so you can adapt always. And with experience, of course, you start to figure out or start to read in the room. And I think that takes us to tip number 3. Try always to stop to ask questions.
What do you mean? I would ask questions, no? To the audience, like to deep dive. Okay, what do you mean?
I really think that people shouldn't just go there and go one strip of consciousness or non-stop on the presentation. I personally, not always happens, but I try to avoid the "does it make sense?" question. Or does this make sense? I try to avoid that one because it kind of implies that you didn't explain yourself well enough. But I would ask a question like, do you have any questions?
Yeah.
Do you have any questions? Okay. Is it clear for you? Or do you want me to continue here, or do you want something else? Because at some point, you may have someone, as you mentioned there, that is super polite and just let you go. Or now they just turn off their cameras and disconnect and they tell you like, so it's about like reading the room at the same time. It helps you like adapt and, so you try to engage with them. Okay.
Yeah. It depends. I will raise a question to anyone who want to comment on that, maybe for this podcast on one of the platform. I like to ask questions around, to redirect potentially the presentation sometimes as it could be necessary. But it depends all structured, and it depends on many people we're presenting to, I guess as well. Yeah. Like small audience, you can be fairly flexible. Like if it's a large audience, you want to avoid questions. You want to avoid question during the presentation, so you're sure to finish on time. Yeah. What other tip do you have on your side?
Tip number 4, always try to make it visual, because we're talking about data presentations, right? And visual, everything is a visual, but or I don't know if you've been in these presentations where someone is just showing a random set of numbers on a table or sometimes in Excel. And, I guess that sounds basic as well, but you can keep your numbers like that, right? But why don't you, for example, you can now even leverage the slide animations to even actually make it more attractive to the visualization, right? So if you cannot get rid of your, for example, if you're showing a KPI, just try to play with the visualization there, right? Just try to make it appealing, because sometimes when you don't make it visually appealing, people will stop listening to what you're saying because they are going to be trying to figure out what they're seeing, right? So if you have like a bunch of numbers all over the place,
try to interpret what they're seeing. Yeah.
Yes, they're going to be with you, but you don't want to be so unappealing that it's distracting or so confusing.
Oh yeah, it's an entire presentation, entire topic, entire session. Yeah, all that.
Quick one. If you're enjoying this episode and our show, please make sure that you follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram at the Data Coffee Break Podcast. Links in the description.
Also, if you'd like to grow this community with us, think about sharing this episode with a friend or a colleague interested about all things data.
Now back to the episode.
All right, so we are at number 5, if I remember. Yeah, I would say the power of storytelling.
Yes.
In the sense that data can be super dry, like in particular for an audience which is not used to read data, read chart or read crosstabs or table number of numbers, thing like that. So being able to wrap that in a comprehensive story, that's so powerful. The best way to remember that, and I think we will put the link in the description of this episode, is the very famous, how many years ago, I don't remember, but the very famous presentation from Hans Rosling. And it's basically 200 countries across 200 years in 4 minutes. And it's basically going across some metrics, life expectancy, capital. I'm not sure what exactly is a metric, but basically like the salaries, life expectancy, and maybe other metrics. But it's so impressive because this could be simply a crosstab. This could be 3-4 charts. No, he made it in an animated manner, and most importantly, he wrapped up in a storytelling. So he's actually telling something that we're learning, like what's happening in the moment when we had World War One and the second one. So how did it change for which countries, for which continent? It's like so incredible. And I'm sure there is so many books and so many videos we can find to learn around that, and it's paramount to learn to present your data. That's my point of view. That will be that's part of the top tips for sure. That could be the number 1 maybe.
No, I agree. I there is nothing more than having storytelling. I do believe that is a skill though. Like not everyone is savvy enough at the beginning, but storytelling is powerful.
But for a data scientist, a data analyst, that should be a skill. Is call that a soft skill. Some people will say that's a skill to absolutely acquire in this kind of role. I feel, and to actually put on that. So maybe tip number 6 in this case: 1 chart, 1 visual equal 1 insight. Don't try to overload with the information you're taking from on 1 chart. So obviously, when you put it visual, this helps depending on the kind of chart, the kind of graphic you're using to like highlight this kind of information, this kind of data. This helps you to drive 1 insight, and that's what you should ask yourself is like, what is the single most important learning I want my audience to extract from this data, and that could be from this specific visual. So that could be interesting on this one.
How can you help the audience for example, the audience that you're presenting to explain it? For example, sometimes I just see a bar chart with a title and that's it. And I'm not going here again into the visualization, but what do you mean, like to make sure that you can explain?
On this point is making sure, like sometimes people will drive like multiple conclusions, multiple insights, major insights, using one simple visual, which is fine. But you don't want to overwhelm with, again, depending on your audience, you don't want to overwhelm with information. And also having two insights with one chart, it's possible, obviously, but that means you can present the data in another way to represent the other insights you discovered or you potentially unfolded.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is not like a hard line one to one, but that will be recommended. I saw some cases where people drove like so many different conclusions in one single chart, where this could have been break down into multiple one. And coming back to your point, it's super important to obviously use legends correctly, titles, colors, etc. are quite important as well.
We're going to have a visualization best practices. I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
Feel free to comment if you would like that. If you would like that, and if you have someone in mind that you would like to hear from, just put it on the comments.
Definitely. So, what are other tips? I think it's number 7 now.
Yes, number 7. It's always do a dry run.
Yes, definitely.
We tend to do dry runs when the presentation seems to be like a super important, right? Like you do dry runs before, if you present in a conference, a webinar, or you're going to have that meeting, the meeting. However, what we were thinking here is that honestly, you can do a dry run for everything you want, right? You can present to friends, colleagues, people you live with.
Yeah.
That even that they're not aware of this project, maybe they are not even part of your company, and you could actually validate that if you not only that if your message that you try to convey is clear, but also like if the content well structured or the visuals are making sense. And I think it gives you so much experience, and you always grow from feedback. I think having big feedback is something that is really important, and sometimes we take it for granted.
Yeah, and I remember some people will do dry run on themselves. Like I remember in the office, I could see a colleague nearly closing his eyes, and I can see him like speaking, mumbling, and he was basically going through his presentation that he was going to present to a client. That's a fine thing. And the other thing, importance of dry run. I remember when I prepared to interview for my first job in the data industry, I was using my flatmate at the time to dry run. Being French person, I have a certain level of difficulty to pronounce worksheet. So that was like a very like a big rehearsal to be able to pronounce this word many times.
Yeah, without sounding something else.
That also helps. Like if English is not your first language and you need to present in English or in any other language, literally, be able to pronounce correctly the words. Maybe it's good to practice orally first on someone else.
100%. 100% agree. What else do we have, Mark?
All right. So we are at point number 8. In particular, if it's face-to-face, like in-person presentation, I would say to present to your audience, not to your data or to your slide deck. And I say that because I went through the reality of making the mistake myself. It's simply that you need to obviously know what you're going to present, and try to not look all the time at the screen behind you, what is projected, and look at your audience. The audience is interested about your presentation, is interested about what you convey as a message. The slides, the visuals that you have should actually just be a support. That shouldn't be the driving factor here. It's a matter of like positioning yourself correctly on stage or in a room to present, and make sure to always have your face, your mouth facing the audience, which is also super important in terms of like for the voice to port your voice to the back of the room, to the back of the space for people to hear. I don't know if you had that. We all do a bit of this mistake, obviously.
I remember having a manager, one previous employer, that told me, like, when you're presenting, make sure that when you're talking, that the person at the end of the room, no matter how big your room is able to listen to you. That is what, but that's thing that keeps you looking at your audience, right? I would say even on video conferences, like whatever Zoom, Teams, Meet. I think now is kind of like a standard having two screens, right? I tend to have even if I'm presenting my screen, I try to have like one screen showing the participants so you can see the reactions. I mean, it's really important, right? So to present to your audience, because you can also, that helps you reading your audience. I mean, that's see how they react as much as you can.
Video presentation is difficult for that because many people will stop putting their camera on, which is a bit annoying in this case.
I know. Mean,
that they're right, but I will try to force people to share their video.
Sometimes it's impossible. Like you cannot.
Yeah.
And with that, actually, we can go to tip number 9 on engagement. And it's like, don't forget to have fun, right? I mean, we work. I think all of us as professionals, we work at least 8 hours per day, right? And if it's not fun, then what are we doing? So just remember that whatever your data is beautiful. It always is. Mm-hmm. And if you're passionate about what you are presenting, that passion will be transmitted or is contagious with everybody. And it's always like, again, it sounds perhaps, it is something that is easier to say than doing. But I really think that if you bring your passion in and you generally have fun when what you're doing, I think your presentation is going to be immediately better. Do you agree with that one, Mark?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to say it's like a relationship with the data you can have, but some data might not be as exciting for you as all the data set you're analyzing or the project you're working on. But trying to find like the fun part in it, like maybe the fun could be in the way you create the visuals, or the fun could be in the way you're going to create the storytelling around it. That's all good ways to make it a more enjoyable experience for you in your work, or if it's outside work as well, and for your audience to be able to receive the message in a very positive way. Super important, obviously. Yeah. And so last tip, obviously paramount, opening and closing are quite essential. When we speak about opening, it could be exposing the problem correctly that you are analyzing, the why behind this kind of questioning, and like also giving some background about the data you're using, like it's been collected or accurate it could be. So again, depending on the audience, like giving a fair level of information. That's to build also a certain level of trust, I would say, because you don't want to throw some data and conclusion, and people will say like, well, what's the sample size? Like, where is the data coming from, etc. On the opening, on the closing, it's obviously you build a story, you presented your data. So now what? Literally, what's the conclusion? What can we learn from that? Can you provide some recommendation based on this data? So I would say, like, think about it as like a 2-minute pitch to conclude the presentation. It's kind of like, I summarize what we've seen. This is what we learn, and potentially those are my recommendations based on what we've seen and what I've analyzed. That also help you to raise as an individual, because you're not just here to analyze and interpret the data, but you can also potentially bring some value by giving some recommendation here.
I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. This one, it's difficult to disagree with.
It's a difficult piece, obviously.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. If you're just starting your career or getting started with presenting or getting more into that, you can start with a simple structure. And this is an advice that I got from one of my first accounts executives I was working with. For every presentation, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them.
Tell.
It's just three simple steps. Tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. So you expose the problem. Like, for example, you just can start saying like, today we're going to discuss the incidents that are having escalated in our product. Then you go and tell them those. What are them? And then you finish saying like, this is why, and then this is why we believe that's finding this, and so on and so on. So again, it's just advice, just a tip, right?
Definitely. No, I like this one. It just came back to my mind, like maybe it's a tip 11, or like going back to the tech, just thought about it, like going back to the tip number 1, so one bis. Term of tech will be to add, if you're presenting your data, so you're sharing your screen on the virtual presentation, but it can be also like in person, and you need to point your mouse to a specific place on the screen, to a chart, etc. One, go slowly, because if you tell them, look at here, and with you and you move everywhere in the screen, they're going to feel sick after 2 minutes. And second, potentially using one of the magnifier or one of the tools that is going to create a halo around. So there is obviously one for Windows, there is for Mac, for all of them. So that would be a good tips on the technology perspective, like one bis coming back to the first.
Supercharge your mouse pointer. Let us know if you agree. You can reach out to us and give us your point of view. Remember, this is all about creating a community, right? So looking forward to what we can to what we receive.
Definitely. And for sure, there is much more tips. Happy to learn about what you have to share with us and everyone else. Yeah. With that, Christian, that was fantastic. So see you next Tuesday for a new episode with a guest.
See you next Tuesday. Thanks for listening to this episode. This podcast represents our views and not the ones of our employers.
Our mission at the Data Coffee Break podcast is to inform you and help you grow in this always changing data field.
Follow us and get into the conversation with the community on our LinkedIn page and Instagram.
See you next Tuesday, and until then, keep your data caffeinated.